Welcome to History for Sleep. Tonight, we journey back in time to the story of a man who ruled the largest empire on earth, yet his greatest battles were fought within the quiet confines of his own mind. He was a warrior who craved peace, a Caesar who studied philosophy, a master of the world who sought mastery only over himself. This is the story of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher in armor. So close your eyes, quiet your thoughts, and let us travel to the 2nd century, to a world perched on the edge of a golden age, unaware of the darkness that was about to descend. In the mid-2nd century after Christ, the vast Roman world was held together by tangible things. An empire of millions was connected by thousands of miles of stone roads, by legions that guarded the frontiers, and by ships that safely crossed the Mediterranean Sea under a single authority. The Roman Empire was not just a place on a map. For those living within its borders, it was the world itself. It stretched from the mists of Britain to the hot sands of Egypt, from the shores of the Atlantic to the rivers of Mesopotamia. For the first time in history, a vast portion of humanity lived under a single, stable government. This was the era later known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. More specifically, it was the height of the age of the 5 good emperors, a succession of rulers so wise and competent that the historian Edward Gibbon would later call this time the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. For an entire century, the throne had passed not from father to son, but from the chosen emperor to the most capable successor he could find. This system of adoption had given Rome leaders like Trajan, who expanded the empire to its greatest extent, and Hadrian, who consolidated its borders and beautified its cities. By the time our story begins, under the calm and peaceful reign of Antoninus Pius, this golden age seemed as if it would last forever. War was something that happened far away, on the distant frontiers, a story told by a returning soldier. A person could be born, live their entire life, and die in Italy, or Greece, or Spain, without ever seeing an armed conflict. Trade flourished. A merchant could send goods from Syria to Gaul with a degree of safety and predictability that would not be seen again for over 1,000 years. Cities were clean, well-administered, filled with magnificent public buildings, aqueducts that brought fresh water from miles away, and public baths that were centers of social life. Justice, administered through a sophisticated legal system, was slow, but it was reliable. The world felt orderly, rational, and secure. It was into this world, this apex of human civilization, that a boy was born. A boy of a noble family, destined for a life of quiet privilege and public service. He was not ambitious for power. He showed no thirst for military glory. His passions were for books, for learning, and for the quiet pursuit of wisdom. He was taught to be just, patient, and self-controlled. The world he was being prepared for was a world of peace, managed by reasonable men making sensible decisions in the marbled halls of the Senate. But history is a river, and its currents are often cruel and unpredictable. The calm waters of this golden age were about to become a raging storm. From beyond the frontiers, new peoples were migrating, pushing against the borders with a force the empire had not felt in centuries. From the east, ancient rivals were gathering their strength. And from within, a silent, invisible enemy was waiting to be unleashed, a plague that would decimate the population and shake the foundations of Roman society. The world this boy was being trained to inherit was about to vanish, and he, the quiet scholar, the reluctant ruler, would be forced to spend nearly his entire reign at war, not in a palace, but in a muddy tent on a frozen frontier. He would have to command armies, confront plague, put down rebellions, and hold a crumbling world together, all while trying to remain true to the philosophical principles he held so dear. This is the story of how that boy, Marcus Aurelius, became the last of the good emperors, and the first to witness the beginning of the end. Before the storms, there was the long, peaceful afternoon of an empire. This era, the world into which Marcus Aurelius was born, was defined by the man who sat on the throne for 23 years. Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus, known to history simply as Antoninus Pius. He was the fourth of the 5 good emperors, and perhaps the most peaceful of them all. He earned his title, Pius, meaning dutiful, from the Roman Senate for his gentle character and his deep respect for tradition and the gods. Unlike his predecessors, Trajan and Hadrian, who were constantly touring the provinces or leading armies, Antoninus Pius almost never left Italy. He governed the largest empire on earth from his palace near Rome, managing its affairs with the careful, steady hand of a responsible landowner tending to his estate. His style of rule was conservative and cautious. He initiated no great conquests and undertook no radical reforms. His primary goal was to maintain the stability he had inherited. When border skirmishes arose, as they inevitably did in places like Britain or along the Danube, he dispatched his generals to handle them, rarely deeming the conflicts worthy of his personal presence. His reign was so famously tranquil that a story was told of him remarking that he would rather save a single citizen than kill 1,000 enemies. This sentiment captured the spirit of the age. For the people living in the heart of the empire, in Italy, Greece, North Africa, or southern Spain, the reign of Antoninus Pius was a time of unprecedented security. This security was built on the foundations of law and logistics. The Mediterranean Sea, once a haven for pirates, was now a Roman lake, policed by the imperial navy. This allowed for the uninterrupted flow of trade. Most importantly, it guaranteed the annona, the massive shipment of grain from Egypt and North Africa that fed the million inhabitants of Rome. A reliable food supply kept the capital city content and stable. Across the provinces, Roman law provided a predictable framework for resolving disputes. A merchant in Ephesus knew he was subject to the same basic legal principles as a farmer in Gaul. This created a sense of shared civilization, a concept known as Romanitas or Romanness. People from different cultures and speaking different native tongues were united by their status as subjects, and in many cases, citizens, of this single universal empire. Society was, of course, deeply stratified. For the elite, the senatorial families from which Marcus Aurelius came, it was a world of immense wealth and cultured leisure. They were educated in Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, and rhetoric. They owned vast agricultural estates across the empire and spent their time managing their wealth, participating in local government, and occasionally serving in high office in Rome. Theirs was a life of opulent townhouses and sprawling country villas. For the vast majority, life was one of hard physical labor. A farmer tilling his field in the Italian countryside, a dock worker hauling sacks of grain in Alexandria, a miner digging for silver in Spain. Their daily struggles were immense. Yet even for them, the peace of the Antonine age brought tangible benefits. They were largely safe from the devastation of war. The roads allowed them to bring their goods to market. And the law, while often favoring the rich, offered at least a theoretical protection against the worst forms of injustice. It was a world where a person could reasonably expect to live out their life in the same place they were born, and to pass on their trade or their land to their children. This simple predictability was a luxury unknown for much of human history. But this deep peace fostered a subtle and dangerous complacency. The legions that guarded the frontiers were still the most formidable military machine in the world, but they had grown comfortable. A generation of soldiers had enlisted, served their 25 years, and retired without ever participating in a major campaign. The skills of large-scale warfare, the discipline required for grueling marches and pitched battles, were beginning to fade into memory. The quiet on the borders was not a sign of permanent peace, but merely a pause. Beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers, vast movements of peoples were underway. Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, pushed by conflict and population growth in the far north, were slowly but surely migrating south, their eyes fixed on the wealth and fertile lands of the Roman Empire. The peace was an illusion, a beautiful but fragile bubble, and the men in power in Rome had grown so accustomed to it, they could not see the pressures building against it. This was the world that shaped young Marcus Aurelius. He grew up surrounded by books, not swords, by philosophers, not generals. He was being groomed for a world that was already beginning to disappear. On the 26th of April, in the year 121 AD, a boy was born into this world of gilded peace. His full name at birth was Marcus Annius Verus, a name he shared with his father and his grandfather. He was not born into the ancient patrician aristocracy of Rome, the families who could trace their lineage back to the founding of the city. His family, the Annii Veri, were a different kind of nobility. They were provincials, originally from a small town in Hispania Baetica, a region in the south of modern-day Spain. Through shrewd business dealings, agriculture, and generations of public service, they had become fabulously wealthy and politically influential. By the time of Marcus's birth, they were one of the most prominent families in the empire, yet they retained the practical, hard-working ethos of their provincial roots, a quality that set them apart from the often decadent old money of Rome. The boy's life was marked by loss from a very early age. His father died when he was only 3 years old. This event, which he likely could not fully comprehend at the time, fundamentally altered the course of his upbringing. He was raised not in his own father's house, but in the home of his paternal grandfather. This man, also named Marcus Annius Verus, was a towering figure in Roman politics. He had served as consul 3 times, an extraordinary honor that signified immense prestige and the emperor's favor. It was from his grandfather that young Marcus learned the core Roman virtues. In his later writings, he would thank his grandfather for teaching him good character and how to control his temper. In that household, he was surrounded by the quiet dignity and gravitas of the old Roman way. He learned the importance of duty, of placing the needs of the state above personal desires, and of carrying oneself with a seriousness befitting a member of the ruling class. His grandfather's home was his first and most important school. While his grandfather forged his public character, his mother, Domitia Lucilla, cultivated his private one. She was an exceptionally wealthy woman in her own right, having inherited a vast brick and tile manufacturing business that supplied building materials to some of the most famous structures in Rome. But despite her wealth, she instilled in her son a love of simplicity. Marcus would later credit her with teaching him piety, generosity, and to live a life far removed from the extravagant habits of the rich. It was from her that he learned to eat simple food, to use plain furniture, and to avoid superstition. This maternal influence provided a crucial balance to his grandfather's stern, public-facing morality. It gave him an inner compass, a sense of personal ethics that was not concerned with appearances, but with the genuine state of one's soul. This combination of influences, the public duty from his grandfather and the private simplicity from his mother, produced a boy of unusual character. In an age where the children of the elite were often spoiled and arrogant, Marcus was serious, thoughtful, and almost unnaturally honest. And people began to notice. The most powerful man in the world, the Emperor Hadrian, was a distant relative and took a special interest in the boy. Hadrian was a brilliant, restless, and deeply perceptive ruler, and he saw something special in young Marcus. He enjoyed the boy's company, impressed by his refusal to engage in the flattery and insincerity that defined court life. As a playful sign of affection, Hadrian gave the boy a nickname, Verissimus. It was a play on his family name Verus, but it meant the most truthful. It was a name that stuck, a testament to the powerful impression of integrity that this young child made on those around him. From his earliest years, he was being marked for greatness, not by his own ambition, but by the quiet force of his character. He was being raised in the shadow of power, taught by his family how to wield it responsibly, long before he ever knew it would one day be his. The education that forged Marcus Aurelius was both typical for a young Roman nobleman and, in its ultimate focus, utterly unique. He began, as all boys of his class did, with a grounding in rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, which was the essential skill for any aspiring politician or lawyer. He studied Latin and Greek literature, immersing himself in the great works of poets and historians. He was trained in the law, and he undertook the rigorous physical conditioning expected of a future leader, which included running, wrestling, and martial sports. But while other young men saw this education as a means to an end, a way to win fame in the law courts or power in the Senate, Marcus came to see it as something more. For him, the purpose of education was not to achieve success, but to build a virtuous character. This shift in focus was due to a series of remarkable tutors who shaped his mind. In the first book of his Meditations, written decades later, he would thank them each by name, listing the specific lessons he learned from them in a display of lifelong gratitude. One of the earliest and most pivotal was a man named Diognetus. He was not a famous philosopher but a painter, and it was he who first introduced Marcus to the philosophical way of life. Diognetus taught the young boy to question popular beliefs and to distrust the tales of miracle workers and charlatans. He encouraged Marcus to embrace a Spartan simplicity, to sleep on a hard plank bed with only a simple animal skin for a blanket, and to wear the rough, plain cloak of a philosopher. This was a radical departure from the soft, luxurious life of an aristocrat. It was a form of physical and mental training, designed to build resilience and to free the mind from a dependence on comfort. As he grew older, his philosophical education deepened under the guidance of men who were not just teachers, but living examples of the principles they taught. The most important of these was Quintus Junius Rusticus. Rusticus was a leading figure in the Stoic school of philosophy, but he was also a highly respected politician who had served as consul. He was a man of action, not just words, and he taught Marcus that the goal of philosophy was not to craft elegant sentences, but to live a good life. Rusticus urged him to read with purpose, not just for entertainment, and to avoid the theatrical speaking style that was popular at the time. Most importantly, it was Rusticus who provided Marcus with a copy of the lectures of Epictetus, a former slave from Phrygia who had become one of the most profound Stoic teachers. This book became the central text of Marcus's life. Epictetus taught that the key to a tranquil life was to distinguish between what is in our control and what is not. Our health, our wealth, our reputation, the actions of others. These are ultimately not in our control. The only thing truly in our power is our own mind, our judgments, our intentions, and our responses to events. To a young man surrounded by the immense power and unpredictability of the Roman court, this idea was a revelation. It offered a path to inner freedom, a fortress of the mind that no political intrigue or personal tragedy could ever breach. Other teachers reinforced these lessons. From Apollonius of Chalcedon, he learned intellectual independence and the importance of relying on reason alone, even in the face of intense pain or the loss of a child. From Cornelius Fronto, the most famous orator of his day, he learned the craft of writing and public speaking. Their surviving letters reveal a warm, deeply affectionate relationship, but also a fundamental disagreement. Fronto worried that Marcus's intense focus on Stoic philosophy was making him too cold and detached, robbing his prose of its passion. But Marcus had made his choice. While he respected Fronto immensely, he had decided that the pursuit of virtue was more important than the pursuit of fame as a great speaker. His commitment was not merely academic. He lived the philosophy he was learning. He rose early and studied late into the night, often to the detriment of his health. He was known for his serious demeanor, his simple dress, and his courteousness to all, regardless of their station. While his peers pursued pleasure and status, he pursued wisdom. This intense dedication was highly unusual. For most Roman nobles, philosophy was a useful tool or an interesting hobby. For Marcus Aurelius, it was becoming the very foundation of his existence. By the time he reached early manhood, his education had provided him with more than just knowledge. It had given him a powerful moral framework, a set of principles designed to build an unshakable character. This inner fortress, so carefully constructed during the long peace of his youth, would soon be tested by a series of crises that would have broken any lesser man. To understand how Marcus Aurelius would later endure war, plague, and betrayal, we must first understand the core principles of the philosophy that became his guide. This was not a mere intellectual hobby for him. It was an entire operating system for his mind, a practical guide on how to be a good human being in a difficult world. This philosophy was Stoicism. It had been founded centuries earlier in Athens by a merchant named Zeno who lost everything in a shipwreck and, in his ruin, discovered philosophy. He used to teach from a public colonnade known as the Stoipoikal, or painted porch, and from that porch, his followers came to be known as the Stoics. The ultimate goal of a Stoic was to achieve a state called eudaimonia. This Greek word is often translated as happiness, but it means something much deeper than a fleeting feeling of pleasure. It means human flourishing, a state of deep contentment, inner peace, and resilience that is independent of external circumstances. It is the tranquility that comes from knowing you are living a rational, virtuous life, no matter what chaos unfolds around you. The Stoics built this worldview on a foundational belief about the nature of the universe. They believed that the entire cosmos was a single, living, and rationally ordered entity. They called this guiding intelligence the logos, a Greek term meaning reason or word. To them, the universe was not a random collection of chaotic events, but a vast, interconnected organism, where everything that happens, from the rising of the sun to the falling of a leaf, is part of a grand, coherent plan. Every individual person, they taught, contains a small spark of this universal reason within them. From this idea came the central Stoic maxim, "Live in accordance with nature." This simple phrase had a dual meaning. First, it meant living in accordance with our own human nature. The defining characteristic of a human being, the thing that separates us from other animals, is our capacity for reason. Therefore, a good human life is one guided by logic, clear judgment, and self-awareness, not one hijacked by destructive emotions like irrational fear, petty jealousy, or uncontrolled rage. This is the source of the most common misconception about Stoicism. A Stoic is not a person who feels no emotion. Marcus Aurelius certainly felt grief, frustration, and anger. The difference is that a Stoic does not let these emotions dictate their actions. Reason remains the pilot of the ship, observing the turbulent weather of emotion without letting it drive the vessel onto the rocks. The second meaning was to live in accordance with the nature of the universe as a whole. If the cosmos is guided by a rational logos, and everything that happens is part of its plan, then it is fundamentally irrational to fight against reality. To rage against a storm, to lament a misfortune, or to wish that other people were different from how they are, is as pointless as being angry at a stone for falling downwards. The Stoic accepts the unchangeable facts of life with a calm resolve they called amor fati, a love of fate. This is not a passive, helpless resignation. It is an active and powerful choice to conserve one's energy, focusing it only on the narrow domain that we truly control, our own thoughts and actions. This leads to the final, crucial pillar of Stoic ethics, the idea that virtue is the sole good. The Stoics categorized everything in life into three buckets. There were good things, bad things, and indifferent things. In the bad category, they placed the vices: foolishness, injustice, cowardice, and indulgence. In the good category, they placed only one thing: virtue, which they saw as the practical expression of reason. Everything else, wealth and poverty, health and sickness, pleasure and pain, fame and obscurity, they placed in the category of indifference. This did not mean they didn't care about these things. A Stoic would prefer to be healthy rather than sick, wealthy rather than poor. But these things were indifferent to one's moral character. They are external to us, and fate can give them or take them away at any moment. A person can be good while being poor and sick, and a person can be wicked while being rich and healthy. Therefore, attaching your inner peace to these external things is a recipe for misery. The only thing that is truly yours, the only thing that can make your life a success or a failure, is the quality of your own character. For Marcus, this philosophy was not a comforting theory. It was a set of tools, a daily practice for the mind. It was the blueprint he would use to build his inner fortress. For Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism was never a passive philosophy, something to be merely read and admired. It was an active, daily training regimen. It was a set of mental exercises he practiced relentlessly to forge the resilience, calm, and clarity of mind he sought. This was how he built what the Stoics called the inner citadel, a mental fortress that could provide shelter from the storms of life. The construction of this citadel relied on several key techniques. The foundation of all these practices was the constant application of what is now called the dichotomy of control. This is the simple but profound idea that some things in life are up to us, while most are not. Marcus would begin his day with this exercise, a practice known as premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of evils. He would tell himself that today he would encounter meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, and dishonest people. By anticipating these difficulties, he was not being pessimistic. He was being prepared. He reminded himself that the negative actions of these people were a result of their own ignorance and were not within his control. The only thing he could control was his own response. He could choose to react with reason, patience, and understanding, rather than with anger and frustration. This morning ritual acted as a kind of psychological armor, protecting his inner calm from the inevitable friction of the day. The second technique was the practice of objective judgment. The Stoics taught that it is not external events themselves that cause us distress, but our opinions and judgments about those events. An insult is merely a sound vibration in the air. It is our judgment that this sound is a terrible offense that causes us pain. The Stoic practice, therefore, is to strip away these subjective emotional layers of judgment and see events for what they truly are. Marcus practiced this relentlessly. He would take something that society viewed as glamorous, like a lavish imperial feast, and break it down into its objective components. The fine roasted bird was simply the dead body of an animal. The expensive purple robes of the emperor were just sheep's wool, dyed with the slime of a shellfish. This exercise was not meant to make life bleak and joyless. It was an antidote to desire and delusion. It allowed him to see things clearly, without the false values that society attaches to them, and thus to be free from their allure. A third powerful tool was a visualization exercise known as the view from above. When feeling overwhelmed by his duties or anxious about the state of the world, Marcus would practice imagining his mind soaring upwards. He would look down upon his own body, then his home, then the city of Rome, and continue rising until he could see the entire planet Earth below him, a tiny sphere in the vastness of space. From this cosmic perspective, he could see all of humanity: armies marching, people farming, ships crossing the sea, families being born and dying. From this height, his own problems, his personal anxieties, even the fate of the mighty Roman Empire, appeared small and fleeting in the immense sweep of time and the cosmos. This was not a form of escapism. It was a technique for gaining perspective. It dissolved his ego, reduced his anxiety, and reminded him that he was a small part of a much larger interconnected whole. Finally, he practiced memento mori, the remembrance of death. Throughout his writings, he constantly reminds himself of the shortness and uncertainty of life. He reflects on the greatest figures of the past: Alexander the Great, Augustus Caesar, Pompey, and notes that both the famous and the forgotten are now all dead and turned to dust. For a Stoic, this was not a morbid or depressing thought. It was a source of meaning and urgency. The awareness of our own mortality strips away all that is trivial. It forces us to ask the most important question: If this were my last day on earth, is this how I would choose to think and act? It was a call to live fully, justly, and with purpose in the present moment, because the present moment is the only thing we ever truly possess. These were the daily drills, the mental gymnastics, that Marcus practiced. This was how the boy named Verissimus, the most truthful, built his inner citadel, brick by brick, thought by thought. And this fortress would soon be needed, as the politics of the empire were about to irrevocably change the course of his life. The Roman Empire's greatest strength was its unity and power. Its greatest weakness was the transfer of that power. The lack of a clear, formalized system of succession was a fatal flaw that had, in the past, plunged the world into devastating civil wars. The long stability of the 2nd century was a direct result of the adoptive system, where each emperor, rather than passing the throne to a biological son, chose the most capable and respected man in the empire to be his heir. The reigning emperor, Hadrian, was a man of genius, a poet, an architect, a restless traveler, and a brilliant administrator. As he entered his final years, his health failing, the problem of succession became his great obsession. He had no children of his own, and he was determined to secure the peace for generations to come. His first choice, made in the year 136, was a surprise to many. He adopted a charismatic and cultured nobleman named Lucius Aelius. Aelius was handsome and popular, but he lacked military and administrative experience, and his health was notoriously delicate. To remedy this, Hadrian sent him to the Danube frontier to command the legions, a trial by fire designed to prepare him for the throne. But it was a test he would never complete. On the very first day of the year 138, after delivering a speech, Lucius Aelius died suddenly. Hadrian's carefully laid plan was in ruins. The emperor himself was now tormented by a painful terminal illness and knew his time was short. He had to act fast. Just weeks after Aelius's death, Hadrian summoned a new man to his bedside. This was Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a wealthy and highly respected senator in his early 50s. Antoninus was the perfect candidate for a crisis. He was known for his calm demeanor, his loyalty, and his integrity. He had no enemies and, more importantly, no towering personal ambitions that might destabilize the state. He was a safe, steady, and reliable choice. Hadrian offered to adopt him and make him the heir to the Roman world. But this offer came with a condition, one of the most complex and far-reaching stipulations in Roman political history. This was Hadrian's Gambit. He told Antoninus that he would adopt him only if, on that very same day, Antoninus himself adopted 2 other boys. The first was the son of the man who had just died, a 7-year-old boy also named Lucius Verus. This was a gesture to honor the memory of his first choice, Aelius. The second boy to be adopted was the 17-year-old Marcus Annius Verus, the serious young man whom Hadrian had long admired, the boy he had nicknamed Verissimus. This was an act of incredible foresight. Hadrian was not just choosing his immediate successor. He was choosing his successor's successor. He knew that Antoninus, being already over 50, would likely have a long but not excessively long reign. This would provide the perfect period of stability for the 2 boys to grow up, learn the art of government, and mature into men ready for power. He was playing a long game, attempting to steer the course of the empire for the next half-century from his deathbed. In Marcus, he saw the future, a young man with the ideal philosophical temperament to rule justly. But Marcus was still too young. Antoninus was to be the bridge, the guardian of the throne who would hold the empire in trust until the true heir, Marcus, was ready. On the 25th of February, 138 AD, the arrangement was made official. In a single day, a cascade of adoptions redefined the imperial family. Hadrian adopted Antoninus. Antoninus, in turn, adopted young Marcus and the child Lucius. The life of Marcus Aurelius was transformed in an instant. His name was officially changed to Marcus Aurelius Verus, linking him to both his new father Antoninus and to Hadrian's first choice, Aelius. He was granted the title of Caesar, marking him as the heir apparent. For a 17-year-old who desired nothing more than a quiet life of philosophical study and contemplation, this must have been a terrifying and unwelcome upheaval. He had been raised in the shadow of power, but now he was formally placed on the path to becoming its very center. He was engaged to be married to Antoninus's daughter Faustina, binding the families together with blood as well as law. His days of sleeping on a hard plank bed and debating with his tutors were not over, but they were now set against a new backdrop of immense and unavoidable public duty. The quiet life he had envisioned for himself had been sacrificed for the needs of the state. Hadrian's Gambit had succeeded. The future of the empire was secure, but the personal freedom of Marcus Aurelius was now a thing of the past. For the next 23 years, from the age of 17 until he was 40, Marcus Aurelius lived in a state of patient waiting. His adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, presided over the longest period of uninterrupted peace the empire had ever known. This calm, stable era became the training ground for the future emperor. While Antoninus managed the state with a gentle and steady hand, Marcus's role was to learn, to observe, and to prepare for the immense responsibility that would one day be his. This period was his long apprenticeship, a time when he had to balance the demands of public office with his deep commitment to philosophy. Outwardly, he was the model heir. Antoninus quickly advanced him through the cursus honorum, the traditional sequence of offices for a Roman aristocrat. He was made consul at an unusually young age, a clear signal of his status. He sat with the emperor during council meetings, listening to debates about law, military appointments, and provincial disputes. He learned the intricate machinery of the Roman state not from books, but from first-hand experience. He studied legal cases, drafted official correspondence, and absorbed the subtle art of diplomacy. Unlike many who saw such duties as a burden, Marcus approached them with his typical seriousness. He saw his work not as a distraction from his philosophy, but as a practical application of it. The principles of justice, diligence, and reason that he studied in the evenings were the very tools he used during the day in the Senate House. The relationship between Marcus and his adoptive father was the central pillar of this period. There was no hint of the jealousy or suspicion that often poisoned the relationship between emperors and their heirs. Marcus genuinely loved and admired Antoninus, viewing him as the ideal ruler and a model of human decency. Decades later, in the opening of his Meditations, Marcus would write a moving tribute to Antoninus, listing the virtues he learned from him through simple observation: the ability to work long hours without needing a break, a willingness to listen patiently to every person's point of view, an indifference to superficial praise, and a character that was firm but never arrogant. He watched how Antoninus lived, and he made that example the blueprint for his own future conduct. In the year 145, this political and personal bond was solidified by marriage. Marcus was wed to Antoninus's daughter, Aeneia Galeria Faustina, who became known as Faustina the Younger. This was a dynastic union, designed to secure the imperial line and leave no doubt as to the succession. Faustina was a woman born to the purple. She had grown up in the imperial household and understood the pressures and protocols of court life better than anyone. History, however, has not always been kind to her. Later Roman sources, particularly the notoriously unreliable Historia Augusta, paint a lurid picture of Faustina as a faithless and decadent empress, engaging in countless affairs with everyone from sailors to gladiators. But modern historians view these accounts with deep skepticism. Such stories were a common form of political slander in the ancient world, an easy way to attack an emperor by maligning the reputation of his influential wife. The most compelling evidence in Faustina's defense comes from Marcus himself. In his own private journal, a book not meant for any other eyes, he speaks of his wife with unambiguous love and gratitude. He thanks the gods for giving him a wife who was so loyal, so affectionate, and so simple. This presents two possibilities, both of which reflect on Marcus's remarkable character. The first is that the rumors were simply false, the malicious gossip of a hostile court, and that their marriage was a genuinely happy and faithful one. The second possibility is that the rumors held some truth, and that Marcus, applying his Stoic principles, was able to look past his wife's flaws, accept what he could not change, and focus instead on her virtues as a partner and the mother of his children. Either way, their partnership was a long and successful one. It was also a union marked by profound personal tragedy. Faustina bore Marcus many children, at least 13 in all. But in a world without modern medicine, child mortality was shockingly high. One by one, most of their children succumbed to illness in infancy or early childhood. These repeated losses must have been a source of immense private grief. Yet it was here that Marcus would have applied his philosophy most rigorously, not to deny his pain, but to endure it. He believed that the death of a loved one, while tragic, was a natural part of life's cycle. He trained himself to accept what fate had given and what fate had taken away, finding the strength to continue his duties as a father, a husband, and an heir, all while carrying the heavy weight of his sorrow. For 23 years he lived this dual life, the public official and the private philosopher, patiently waiting for a power he had never truly wanted. The long wait ended in the early spring of the year 161. At his country estate in Lorium, the Emperor Antoninus Pius, now in his 70s, fell ill with a fever. His decline was swift. In his final moments, he spoke of the state to his assembled council and, in a symbolic transfer of power, ordered the golden statue of Fortune that was kept in his bedchamber to be moved to the room of Marcus Aurelius. His last reported word was equanimitas, meaning equanimity or calmness of mind. It was the perfect summary for his life and his reign. With his death, the long, peaceful afternoon of the Roman Empire came to a quiet end. The Roman Senate, without a moment's hesitation, moved to confirm Marcus Aurelius as the new emperor. He had been the designated heir for 23 years. His character was known, his competence was proven, and his succession was undisputed. The absolute power of the Roman world, a burden that had been carried by men like Augustus, Trajan, and Hadrian, now rested solely on his shoulders. And in his first act as the most powerful man on earth, he did something no one expected. He went before the Senate and refused to accept the power alone. He insisted that his adoptive brother Lucius Verus be elevated to the exact same rank as himself. He argued that Lucius should be given the title of Augustus, the tribunician power, and the name Caesar. In effect, he demanded that the Senate create not one emperor, but two. It was a moment without precedent in Roman history. Lucius Verus was the other boy from Hadrian's grand succession plan, the son of Hadrian's first ill-fated choice. He was 10 years younger than Marcus and in almost every respect, his polar opposite. Where Marcus was serious, introverted, and studious, Lucius was handsome, charismatic, and outgoing. He loved the theater, the gladiatorial games, and lavish parties. He did not share Marcus's deep philosophical bent or his relentless work ethic. While Marcus had spent the last 2 decades immersing himself in the details of law and administration, Lucius had lived the more conventional life of a wealthy, carefree aristocrat. Marcus's decision to share his absolute power with such a man has been debated by historians for centuries. It was an extraordinary act of renunciation, and it likely stemmed from a combination of motives. First, it was an act of profound Stoic humility. Marcus was deeply aware of his own fallibility and the corrupting influence of absolute power. He may have genuinely believed that the burden of managing the entire world was too great for any single human being to bear. Sharing the power was a check against his own potential for arrogance. Second, it was an act of loyalty. He was fulfilling the original dual inheritance vision of the Emperor Hadrian. who had made them brothers through adoption decades earlier. Finally, it was a pragmatic choice. Marcus must have understood that the peaceful era of Antoninus was an anomaly. With dangers brewing on the frontiers, it was strategically wise to have a second emperor, one who could lead armies in the field while he managed the complex administration of the state from Rome. The Senate agreed to his request. For the first time, Rome had two official emperors, two Augusti, reigning as equal partners. In practice, Marcus was the clear senior partner in age, experience, and prestige. He was the guiding mind of the regime. Lucius, younger and more martial in appearance, was the public face and the designated commander. It was a system designed for a new, more dangerous age. And that age arrived almost immediately. The news of the peaceful Antoninus's death was a signal to Rome's enemies that the era of quiet passivity was over. The transition to two new, untested emperors was perceived as a moment of potential weakness. Unrest flared in Britain. Troubles began to stir on the Rhine frontier. And most seriously, in the east, Rome's great rival, the Parthian Empire, saw an opportunity. They launched a full-scale invasion of the client kingdom of Armenia, a direct challenge to Roman authority in the region. The long peace had shattered. The dual emperorship of Marcus and Lucius was about to be tested by a trial of fire. The first great test of the dual reign came from the east. For centuries, the Roman and Parthian empires were the two superpowers of the known world, locked in a long and often tense rivalry. Between them lay the strategic kingdom of Armenia, a mountainous buffer state that both empires sought to control. By tradition, Rome had the right to approve the Armenian king, and any attempt by Parthia to install its own candidate was seen as a direct act of aggression. Shortly after the death of Antoninus Pius, the Parthian king, Vologases IV, decided to test the resolve of the two new emperors. He launched a full-scale invasion of Armenia, drove out the Roman-backed ruler, and placed his own puppet on the throne. The initial Roman response was a catastrophe. The governor of the nearby province of Cappadocia was a man named Marcus Severianus. He was an elderly and somewhat vain senator, who was under the influence of a charlatan prophet named Alexander of Abinoticus. This false oracle had promised Severianus a swift and easy victory over the Parthians. Filled with confidence, Severianus marched a single Roman legion into Armenia, expecting to crush the opposition. Instead, he was lured into a trap. At the town of Elegia, his legion was surrounded by a superior Parthian force and after fighting for 3 days, was completely annihilated. Severianus, facing the humiliation of his defeat, took his own life. This disaster sent a shockwave of panic across the eastern provinces. It was one of Rome's worst military defeats in decades. Emboldened by their victory, the Parthians swept south, invading the vital Roman province of Syria. The local Roman forces there, having grown soft and undisciplined during the long years of peace, were in no condition to stop them. The situation was critical. Back in Rome, the crisis was exactly the kind of scenario that Marcus's dual emperorship was designed to handle. He, as the senior emperor, would remain in the capital. His role was to be the stable administrative heart of the empire, a task for which his temperament was perfectly suited. He oversaw the difficult work of raising new legions, securing the necessary funds from the treasury, and managing the political anxieties of the Senate. He was the grand strategist, the anchor holding the state steady in the storm. Lucius Verus, the younger, more athletic co-emperor, was given supreme command of the war. His duty was to travel to the east and serve as the imperial figurehead of the Roman counteroffensive. His presence was politically essential. It demonstrated the full commitment of the empire to the war and provided a single supreme authority to unify the demoralized eastern armies. Lucius's journey to the east was a slow and magnificent grand tour. Later, hostile historians would portray it as a lazy pleasure cruise, emphasizing how he lingered in the luxurious cities of the Greek world. indulging in parties and entertainments. While his journey was certainly comfortable, it also served a political purpose, allowing him to assert imperial authority across the provinces. He eventually established his headquarters in Antioch, the rich and cosmopolitan capital of Roman Syria, a city famous for its luxury. But Lucius was not a military commander by training or temperament. He was the political leader of the war effort, not its field general. The real task of turning the tide of the war fell to a team of hardened military professionals that Marcus sent with him. The most important of these was a man named Gaius Avidius Cassius. A native Syrian, Cassius was a brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless general. He was given command of the legions in Syria and immediately set about restoring their broken discipline. The Syrian legions had become notoriously complacent, but Cassius, through famously brutal training methods and harsh punishments, quickly whipped them back into a formidable fighting force. He was the perfect man for the job, a ruthless commander for a desperate war. Under the supreme authority of Lucius Verus in Antioch, it was Avidius Cassius and other competent generals who led the Roman armies in the field. The tide began to turn. The Parthian invasion of Syria was halted and pushed back. A methodical and difficult campaign was launched to retake Armenia. The initial crisis had been averted, and the system of two emperors appeared to be working. As Lucius presided over the rear echelon command from his palace, the hard work of winning the war was being carried out by his generals. Rome was on the offensive once more, but no one knew that the victorious soldiers would eventually bring back an enemy far more deadly than the Parthian army. By the year 165, the war in the east had turned into a decisive Roman victory. The brilliant and brutal Avidius Cassius had proven unstoppable. He pushed the Parthian forces out of Roman territory and then launched a massive invasion deep into Mesopotamia, the Parthian heartland. His campaign was a mirror of the one waged by the great Emperor Trajan 50 years earlier. The Roman legions marched down the Euphrates River, and one by one, the great cities of the region fell. The twin capitals of the Parthian Empire, the Greek city of Seleucia and the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, were captured and sacked. The palace of the Parthian king was put to the torch. The victory was total and humiliating for the enemy. In 166, Lucius Verus returned to Rome to celebrate a magnificent triumph. Marcus, in a show of unity, insisted that Lucius be the star of the parade. Chariots filled with captured treasures and Parthian prisoners rolled through the streets of Rome, to the roar of the adoring crowds. Both emperors were awarded the victory title Parthicus Maximus. To the public, it seemed that the new reign had faced its first great challenge and emerged stronger than ever. The system of two emperors had worked perfectly, but the triumphant legions brought back more than just spoils of war. Unseen in the blood and breath of the soldiers, they carried a silent passenger. A terrible sickness had broken out among the troops during the siege of Seleucia. It was an illness of horrifying intensity. The contemporary physician Galen, one of the greatest medical minds of the ancient world, witnessed it firsthand and left a chilling description of its symptoms. It began with a high fever, a sore throat, and intense thirst. Then, after a few days, a gruesome rash would appear, covering the entire body with dark ulcerous pustules that would eventually scab over and fall off. It was accompanied by a foul-smelling cough and a terrible diarrhea that often contained blood. For those who survived, it could leave disfiguring scars and blindness. Today, historians and epidemiologists are almost certain that this was a catastrophic outbreak of a particularly virulent strain of smallpox. To a population with absolutely no prior exposure and therefore no immunity, it was a biological firestorm. The plague spread with terrifying speed. The very things that made the Roman Empire so successful, its magnificent network of roads, its bustling trade routes, and the constant movement of its armies, now became the vectors of its own devastation. The victorious legions from the east were redeployed to other frontiers, particularly to the garrisons along the Rhine and Danube rivers, taking the disease with them. From these military camps, it seeped into the local towns. Merchants and travelers carried it from port to port. Within a few years, there was no corner of the vast empire left untouched. The devastation was unimaginable. In the city of Rome at the plague's peak, it was said that 2,000 people were dying every day. Funeral pyres burned day and night. The death toll across the empire is impossible to know for certain, but modern estimates suggest that it killed between 10 and 18% of the entire population. This translates to a staggering figure of somewhere between 7 and 10 million lives. Whole villages were wiped out. Vast tracts of farmland fell silent, their owners and workers dead. The army was decimated, losing a catastrophic number of trained soldiers, not to enemy swords, but to the invisible enemy in their own barracks. For the people of the 2nd century, this was an apocalypse. The sense of order, reason, and security that had defined the Antonine age was shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of terror and superstitious dread. People sought explanations in the anger of the gods, leading to a rise in mystical cults and the persecution of minority groups, like the Christians, who were blamed for the disaster. The Golden Age was over. The long, peaceful afternoon had given way to a terrifying night. And in the heart of this chaos, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who believed in a rational and ordered cosmos, now had to lead a world that seemed to have descended into madness. In the face of this unprecedented catastrophe, the Roman elite did what the wealthy and powerful have often done in times of plague. They fled. Senators and rich merchants abandoned the crowded, disease-ridden cities for the isolation of their vast country estates. But the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, did not flee. He remained in Rome at the very heart of the suffering. It was an act of extraordinary personal courage and a powerful statement of leadership. His Stoic philosophy had taught him that a good man does his duty, regardless of the danger. And his duty, as the father of his people, was to stay with them in their darkest hour. He confronted the crisis with a blend of rational pragmatism and a keen understanding of public psychology. He summoned the best medical minds of the age, including the physician Galen, to study the disease and offer what little help they could. Recognizing that the piles of unburied dead were a threat to public health and morale, he passed new laws regarding burials and used state funds to pay for the funerals of the poor. Carts rumbled through the city streets day and night, carrying the bodies away for mass burial or cremation. To calm the widespread religious panic, he turned to the traditions of the Roman state religion. He summoned priests from all over the empire, organized grand processions, and performed solemn public rites and sacrifices to appease the gods. As a philosopher who believed in a rational cosmos, he may have personally doubted that such ceremonies could halt the disease. But as a leader, he understood that the terrified population needed the psychological comfort of shared ritual. It was a pragmatic decision to restore a sense of order in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. The plague also triggered a severe economic crisis. With millions dead, tax revenues collapsed. The treasury, already strained by the costs of the Parthian War, was running dry. At the same time, the death of farmers led to widespread agricultural collapse, threatening the food supply. Marcus was faced with a terrible choice: raise taxes on a population that was already suffering immensely, or risk the bankruptcy of the state. He chose a third path. In a move that stunned the Roman aristocracy, he held a massive public auction in the Forum of Trajan. But he was not selling state property. He was selling the personal, private possessions of the imperial household. For 2 months, the treasures of the palace were put on display and sold to the highest bidder. There were goblets of gold and crystal, priceless statues, silken robes embroidered with gold thread, fine furniture, and even the ceremonial jewels of his wife, the Empress Faustina. The auction was a huge success, raising an enormous sum of money that allowed the government to continue functioning and, most importantly, to continue paying the army. This act was a masterstroke of leadership. It demonstrated in the most visible way possible that the emperor was sharing in the hardship of his people. He was sacrificing his own luxury for the good of the state, a perfect embodiment of his Stoic belief that wealth and possessions were indifferent things compared to one's duty. The most dire consequence of the plague, however, was its effect on the military. The legions had been hollowed out by the disease. Experienced centurions and legionaries who had survived the Parthian campaign died in their barracks. This catastrophic loss of manpower came at the worst possible moment. Seeing the empire weakened, the barbarian tribes along the northern frontier were growing restless. The army had to be rebuilt, and quickly. Marcus was forced to resort to desperate measures. For the first time, the legions were open to recruits who would have previously been considered unacceptable. He conscripted gladiators from the arenas, freed slaves with the promise of citizenship, and even recruited bands of highwaymen from the mountains. This was a radical break from tradition, a sign of just how desperate the situation had become. Through it all, Marcus held the state together. In the face of an irrational, terrifying force of nature, he responded with personal courage, practical action, and a profound sense of duty. He calmed the panic and kept the machinery of government from grinding to a halt. But the plague had inflicted a terrible wound on the Roman Empire. Its treasury was depleted, its farms were neglected, and its armies were a patchwork of veterans and raw, unconventional recruits. The empire was weaker and more vulnerable than it had been in over a century. And the enemies on the northern border, who had been watching this slow-motion disaster unfold, knew that their time had come. For centuries, the great Danube River was the northern frontier of the Roman world. It was a line on the map separating the order and civilization of the empire from what the Romans called Barbaricum, the vast, little-understood lands of the Germanic and Sarmatian peoples. This was not a quiet frontier. It was a restless, dynamic border, manned by some of Rome's toughest legions. But during the long peace of Antoninus Pius, a deceptive calm had settled over the region. The tribes beyond the river were seen as a manageable problem, a collection of clients and potential enemies to be kept in check with diplomacy and the occasional show of force. But in the years the plague was raging, this situation changed dramatically. The peoples living across the Danube were not a monolith. They were a complex mosaic of different tribes. Chief among them were the Marcomanni and the Quadi, Germanic peoples who were settled farmers with a fierce warrior tradition. To their east, on the Great Hungarian Plain, lived the Iazyges, a nomadic Sarmatian tribe famous for their heavy armored cavalry, known as cataphracts, who fought with long lances. For years, these tribes had been growing in number and power. More importantly, they were being subjected to immense pressure from behind. Far to the northeast, a massive migration of Gothic peoples was underway, creating a domino effect, pushing other tribes south and west, forcing them directly against the hard border of the Roman Empire. They were not just looking for plunder, they were looking for new lands to settle, and the plague-emptied provinces of Rome looked like a tempting prize. Around the year 166, while the empire was still reeling from the first wave of the plague, the dam broke. A massive coalition of tribes, with the Marcomanni and Quadi at its core, surged across the Danube. This was not a typical border raid. This was a full-scale invasion, a migration of entire peoples on the move. The Roman defenses, which had been stripped of their best troops for the Parthian War and were now hollowed out by disease, were completely overwhelmed. The invaders swept through the Roman provinces of Pannonia and Rhaetia, leaving a trail of fire and destruction. Roman towns were sacked, farms were burned, and the population was either killed or carried off into slavery. For the Romans, this was a new and terrifying kind of war. It was not a professional conflict fought by professional soldiers in a distant land. It was a fight for their homes, a brutal invasion that brought the chaos of the frontier into the civilized heart of the provinces. And then the unthinkable happened. For the first time in nearly 300 years, since the days of the Roman Republic, A barbarian army crossed the Julian Alps and descended into Italy itself. The heartland of the empire, which had been untouched by foreign invasion for centuries, was now under direct attack. The invaders laid siege to the large and prosperous city of Aquileia, one of the most important centers of trade in northern Italy. They utterly destroyed the nearby town of Opitergium. The psychological shock in the city of Rome was profound. The deep sense of security that had defined the Golden Age was shattered forever. Panic gripped the capital as people remembered ancient stories of the Gauls sacking Rome centuries before. As this crisis unfolded, the empire's leadership was in transition. Lucius Verus, returning from the east, fell ill and died from a stroke in early 169, likely a victim of the same plague his armies had brought back. Now Marcus Aurelius was the sole ruler of a reeling empire. The situation was dire. The treasury was empty. The legions were filled with ill-trained recruits. And a massive barbarian army was on Italian soil. The scholar who had spent his life studying how to achieve inner peace now had to learn how to wage total war. The philosopher had no choice but to put on armor and become a field commander, leading his patched-together armies in a desperate struggle, not for glory or for new territory, but for the very survival of the Roman world. In the year 169, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius left the marbled halls and relative comfort of Rome and traveled north to the war. The Danube frontier would become his home for most of the remaining years of his life. He established his primary headquarters at the massive legionary fortress of Carnuntum, located in the province of Pannonia Superior, near modern-day Vienna. This was no palace. Carnuntum was a sprawling, functional military city, a world of wooden barracks, dusty training fields, armories, and imposing fortifications. For years, this grim, windswept outpost on the edge of the civilized world became the de facto capital of the Roman Empire. Here, the philosopher had to fully embrace his role as commander-in-chief. His daily life was one of relentless, grinding work. His days began before dawn and were filled with an endless procession of duties. He met with his generals to plan campaigns, reviewed intelligence reports from scouts, dictated letters and dispatches to every corner of the empire, and presided over legal cases as the supreme judge for the region. He also had to manage the colossal logistical task of feeding, equipping, and paying an army of over 100,000 men in a hostile land. He adapted to this new life by applying his Stoic principles. He did not isolate himself in luxury. He wore the simple woolen cloak of a soldier, ate plain food, and was known for his accessibility and fairness. He shared in the hardships of the frontier, enduring the cold winters and the constant threat of attack. The soldiers came to respect him, not as a brilliant and dashing tactician like Julius Caesar, but as a diligent, dutiful, and unshakable commander who led from the front. They saw his quiet endurance and his absolute commitment to his duty, and they gave him their loyalty. The war itself was a brutal and frustrating affair. It was not a war of glorious, set-piece battles where the disciplined Roman legions could dominate. The Germanic tribes were masters of their terrain and practiced a fluid, unpredictable style of guerrilla warfare. They would launch sudden, savage raids across the river, only to melt back into the dark, dense forests where the Roman legions struggled to follow. They excelled at ambushes and avoided open combat unless they had a clear advantage. Marcus's strategy, therefore, had to be one of slow, methodical, and ruthless attrition. It was a war of logistics and engineering as much as it was a war of combat. His armies built networks of roads and forts, pushing ever deeper into barbarian territory. They cleared vast tracts of forest to deny the enemy cover. They launched relentless punitive expeditions, designed to destroy the enemy's villages and food supplies, forcing them to submit through starvation and exhaustion. He also practiced a shrewd diplomacy, constantly working to break apart the tribal coalitions, making separate peace treaties with some tribes to isolate others. It was a grim, thankless, and incredibly expensive way to fight a war. It was during this period that the great paradox of his life took shape. During the day, he was the supreme commander of the Roman army, surrounded by the noise, violence, and brutal necessities of war. He made decisions that led to the deaths of thousands of people. But at night, in the quiet of his tent, by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, he would retreat into his inner citadel. He would pick up his pen and, in Greek, the language of philosophy, he would write to himself. This is when he composed the majority of the book we now know as the Meditations. He was not writing for publication or for posterity. He was writing as a form of personal therapy, a practical exercise to maintain his own sanity and humanity. He wrote to remind himself to not give in to anger or despair. He wrestled with the problem of how to be a good man in a world of violence. He urged himself to be patient, to be tolerant of the faults of others, and to accept his fate with courage and without complaint. While his armies were fighting a war to secure the borders of the empire, Marcus was fighting a much more difficult war within himself, a battle to ensure that the grim necessities of his office did not corrupt the philosophical principles that formed the core of his identity. The war on the Danube was a long and brutal slog, punctuated by moments of sheer desperation and what seemed to be divine intervention. The most famous of these events occurred during the campaign of 172 AD, a story that became legendary across the empire as the miracle of the rain. A Roman detachment, deep in the territory of the Quadi, found itself in a hopeless situation. They were exhausted from the summer heat, their water supplies were gone, and they had been skillfully herded by the enemy into a dry, exposed basin, where they were completely surrounded. The sun beat down relentlessly. According to the historian Cassius Dio, the soldiers were incapacitated by heatstroke and a terrible thirst, unable to fight or even to lift their shields. The Quadi, confident of their victory, closed in, ready to annihilate the trapped and helpless Romans. Just as all hope was lost, the sky suddenly turned dark. A violent, localized thunderstorm erupted directly over the Roman position. The parched soldiers turned their faces to the sky, catching the life-saving rain in their mouths, their helmets, and on their shields. While the Romans were reviving themselves, the storm turned on their enemies. Lightning bolts crashed into the ranks of the Quadi, throwing them into a panic. Re-energized and believing the gods were on their side, the Romans launched a furious counterattack and secured a stunning victory against a superior force. This event was so significant that it was commemorated on the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, where a carving depicts a giant, bearded sky god bringing rain to the Roman troops. The official pagan explanation was that the emperor's piety had moved Jupiter Pluvius, the god of rain, to intervene. Later Christian authors, however, would claim that Christian soldiers in the legion had prayed to their god, who then produced the miracle. Whatever the true cause, divine intervention or a timely but natural weather event, for the soldiers on the ground, it was a sign of hope, a powerful boost to morale in a war that had offered little to celebrate. But such moments of perceived divine favor were rare. The daily reality of the war was one of unremitting brutality. This was a war of survival, and Marcus, the philosopher, authorized tactics of extreme violence because he saw no other way to secure a lasting peace. Roman sources speak of a scorched earth policy, of a conflict with little mercy shown on either side. The fighting took place in some of the most difficult conditions imaginable. There are accounts of battles fought on the frozen surface of the Danube River during the harsh Pannonian winter. In one famous engagement, the nomadic Iazyges and their armored cavalry charged across the ice. The Romans, unsteady on the slippery surface, had to adapt. They learned to intentionally fall onto their shields, creating a slippery ramp. The charging enemy horses would lose their footing on the polished shields, crashing to the ice and allowing the Roman infantry to close in and finish them. This was the nature of the war, a desperate close-quarters struggle for survival against a tough and resilient enemy. Slowly, year by grinding year, Marcus's strategy of attrition began to work. The tribes, facing starvation and relentless Roman pressure, were worn down. By the year 175, after nearly 8 years of constant warfare, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Iazyges had been decisively defeated. Marcus was on the verge of a total victory. He now began to formulate a bold and permanent solution to the northern frontier problem. Instead of just punishing the tribes and retreating back to the Danube, he planned to annex their lands outright. He intended to create 2 new Roman provinces north of the river, to be named Marcomannia and Sarmatia. This ambitious plan would have pushed the imperial border forward to the more defensible line of the Carpathian Mountains, pacifying the region once and for all. The years of bloodshed and sacrifice were finally about to pay off with a strategic victory that would secure the empire for generations. But just as he stood on the brink of achieving this lasting peace, catastrophic news arrived from the other side of the world. A message came from the east, carrying word of betrayal, a rebellion that would force him to abandon his northern victory and confront a new enemy, this time not a foreign foe but one of his own. The news that arrived from the east in 175 was a devastating blow, not from a foreign enemy, but from the heart of the Roman command. The rebellion was led by Gaius Avidius Cassius. This was a name Marcus Aurelius knew well. Cassius was the brilliant, ruthless general who had single-handedly won the Parthian War. In the years since that victory, Marcus had rewarded him with unprecedented power, making him the supreme commander of all provinces in the east, from Syria to Egypt. He was the most powerful and, until now, the most trusted military leader in the empire. The catalyst for the revolt was a false rumor. Word spread with incredible speed through the eastern provinces that Marcus Aurelius, whose health had always been delicate, had finally succumbed to illness and died in his camp on the Danube. Hearing this, Avidius Cassius acted with lightning speed. He presented himself to his legions, the same battle-hardened troops he had led to victory in Mesopotamia, and had himself proclaimed emperor. The provinces under his command, including the strategically vital grain supply of Egypt, quickly swore allegiance to him. For a short time, he was the undisputed master of the eastern half of the Roman world. An unconfirmed but persistent rumor, reported by ancient historians, added a layer of intrigue to the affair. It was whispered that the Empress Faustina herself, fearing her husband was dead and desperate to find a powerful protector for her young son Commodus in the ensuing power vacuum, had sent a message to Cassius, urging him to seize the throne. The truth of this claim is impossible to verify, but it highlights the panic and uncertainty of the time. Soon, the corrected news reached the east. Marcus Aurelius was still alive. But it was too late. Cassius had already committed the unforgivable crime of treason. He could not turn back. The Roman Empire, already weakened by plague and years of war, now stood on the brink of a catastrophic civil war. It would be a clash of titans. The veteran Danube legions under the command of Marcus against the victorious Eastern legions under the command of Cassius. It was the ultimate nightmare scenario for any emperor. The reaction of Marcus Aurelius to this profound personal and political betrayal is perhaps the clearest window we have into his soul. For as long as he could, he concealed the news from his own soldiers on the northern front, fearing it would shatter their morale. When he could hide it no longer, he gathered his troops and gave a speech, which was recorded by the historian Cassius Dio. The soldiers, expecting a furious tirade against the traitor, heard something else entirely. Instead of rage, Marcus expressed a deep and weary sadness. He lamented the disloyalty of a man he had trusted and promoted, a man he had considered a friend. He grieved over the tragedy that Romans would once again have to fight and kill other Romans. And then, in a statement that must have astonished his hardened legionaries, he told them that his only true regret was the possibility that he would be denied the chance to show mercy. His greatest wish, he said, was to capture Cassius alive, not to execute him, but to forgive him. He wanted to demonstrate to the world how a philosopher king should handle such an injury. not with vengeance, but with reason and magnanimity. This was not a political speech. It was a Stoic sermon delivered on the eve of a potential civil war. As it turned out, the war that Marcus so dreaded never came. The rebellion of Avidius Cassius, which had begun so swiftly, collapsed just as fast. The entire western half of the empire remained unshakably loyal to Marcus. His authority was too deep, his reputation for virtue too strong. Even in the east, key provincial governors refused to join the usurper, and Cassius found himself increasingly isolated. Before Marcus's armies even had to march, a pair of Cassius's own officers, a centurion and a decurion, cornered their commander and killed him. The rebellion was over, just 3 months after it had begun. The head of Avidius Cassius was sent to Marcus as proof of his death. True to his word, the emperor refused to look at it. He would not gloat over the death of his former friend and rival, and he ordered that the head be given a proper burial. He then demonstrated the mercy he had spoken of. He protected Cassius's children from any harm, and when the Senate in Rome, in a fit of vengeful anger, wanted to begin a bloody purge of Cassius's supporters, Marcus intervened and forbade it. The revolt had been a terrible crisis. It had forced him to abandon his hard-won victory in the north and put his grand strategic plans on hold. But his handling of the affair was perhaps the most powerful demonstration of his Stoic principles in action. He had been tested by the ultimate betrayal, and his response was not weakness, but a profound and philosophically grounded strength. After the rebellion of Avidius Cassius was crushed, Marcus Aurelius did not immediately return to the war on the Danube. He embarked on a long tour of the eastern provinces, Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor, to restore loyalty and heal the political wounds left by the revolt. It was during this journey, and in the grim military camps of the northern frontier, that he continued the remarkable practice he had started years earlier. In the quiet hours of the night, after a long day of commanding an empire, he would write. The result of this practice is the book we know today as the Meditations. But it was never intended to be a book. It had no audience in mind other than himself. The title we use was added centuries later. His own heading for the work was simply ta iis houton, a Greek phrase meaning to himself. He wrote it in Greek, the language of philosophy and high culture, not in Latin, the language of Roman law and government. This was a private conversation, a series of notes, reminders, and exercises aimed at preserving his own mind. What makes this work so powerful is the context in which it was written. This is not the product of a scholar in a peaceful library. It is the journal of a man living under immense, relentless pressure. He was writing in a military tent on the frozen banks of the Danube, surrounded by the constant threat of death, disease, and the grinding stress of total war. The book is not a work of abstract theory. It is a raw, practical guide to maintaining one's humanity in the worst imaginable circumstances. It is the ultimate record of his effort to live his philosophy. The themes he returns to again and again are the core exercises of a Stoic mind in training. He constantly reflects on the impermanence of all things. He reminds himself that life is breathlessly short, that fame is meaningless because both the famous and those who praise them will soon be dead and forgotten. He writes, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly." This was not meant to be depressing. It was a tool to create urgency and to strip away trivial anxieties. A huge portion of the book is dedicated to the problem of dealing with other people. He gives himself practical advice on how to endure the frustrating, unjust, or simply annoying actions of others. He reminds himself that all people are part of a single human community, all sharing a spark of divine reason. People do wrong, he argues, only out of ignorance of what is good. The proper response, therefore, is not anger or retribution, but patience, understanding, and a commitment to one's own just conduct. He constantly writes about his duty, what he calls the common good. He sees human society as an organism like a beehive, in which each individual has a natural role to play for the benefit of the whole. His job as emperor was not a privilege that granted him power. It was a service he owed to the human community. He writes, "What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee." This was his guiding principle, a constant reminder to put the needs of his people before his own comfort or desires. Above all, the book is the act of retreating into his inner citadel. It is filled with reminders to distinguish between external events, which he cannot control, and his own judgments about those events, which he can. He tells himself that the world can be a chaotic and violent place, but his own mind can remain a fortress of calm, reason, and peace, if he trains it to be so. He writes, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The survival of this book is a historical miracle. As a private journal, it could easily have been lost or destroyed after his death. But it was preserved, copied by scribes through the centuries, a quiet thread of reason running through ages of darkness and upheaval. The Meditations is not a work of triumph. It is a work of struggle. It is the brutally honest account of a good man's fight to stay good in a world that seemed determined to break him. Marcus Aurelius was the ultimate product of the Roman Empire's greatest political innovation, the system of adoptive succession. For nearly a century, the throne had passed not by the accident of birth, but by a deliberate choice. Each of the 5 good emperors had selected the most capable man he could find, adopted him as his son, and trained him to rule. This golden chain of merit had given the empire unprecedented stability and a series of exceptional leaders. But Marcus faced a dilemma that none of his 4 predecessors had. He was the first of them in over 80 years to have a legitimate biological son who survived into adulthood. This simple fact of biology would lead to his most fateful and tragic decision. His son's name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus, and in almost every respect, he was the antithesis of his father. Where Marcus was introverted, studious, and self-disciplined, Commodus was vain, lazy, and completely driven by his appetites. He possessed none of his father's interest in philosophy, law, or the tedious work of administration. His passions were for the thrilling spectacle of the chariot races and, above all, for the bloody sand of the gladiatorial arena. He was tall, strong, and handsome, and saw himself not as a future statesman, but as a kind of celebrity athlete, a real-life Hercules. The troubling signs of his character were apparent from a young age. Marcus provided him with the best tutors in the empire, surrounding him with men of learning and integrity. But the lessons never took hold. Commodus was bored by his studies and preferred the company of gladiators and court flatterers. Marcus, the man who believed so deeply in the power of reason and education to shape a virtuous soul, was confronted with the frustrating reality that he could not mold the character of his own son. This leads to the most agonizing question of Marcus's reign. Why did he break the golden chain of adoption? Why did this wise philosophical emperor choose to name his clearly unworthy son as his successor, setting the stage for disaster? There is no simple answer, but it likely came down to a combination of a father's love and grim political reality. Marcus had lost so many children in infancy. At least 8 of his sons had died. Commodus was the one who had survived. It is possible that Marcus was simply blinded by a father's desperate hope, a belief that the immense responsibility of the throne would somehow forge his son into the man he needed to be. But the more likely explanation is that he felt he had no other choice. By the mid-170s, Commodus was already the publicly acknowledged heir. The army, which was becoming increasingly attached to the idea of hereditary succession, knew him as the emperor's son. To suddenly disinherit him and adopt a seasoned general or a respected senator could have been seen as a grave insult, an act that could have easily triggered a new and bloody civil war, the very thing Marcus had fought so hard to avoid. After the traumatic rebellion of Avidius Cassius, the emperor's highest priority was a peaceful and undisputed transfer of power. Ironically, naming his flawed son may have seemed like the safest and only path to ensuring that peace. In 177 AD, Marcus made his decision official. He elevated the 16-year-old Commodus to the rank of Augustus, making him his official co-emperor. He then brought his son with him to the front lines on the Danube. The plan was to immerse the young man in the harsh realities of war and command, hoping that the experience would burn away his frivolity and instill in him a sense of duty, just as it had tested and forged Marcus himself. The experiment was a failure. On the frontier, Commodus showed little interest in military strategy, preferring to spend his time hunting and enjoying the company of his friends. He chafed under the harsh discipline of the military camp and longed for the pleasures and adulation he had known in Rome. Marcus, now an aging and weary man, must have watched this with a heavy heart. His philosophy had given him the strength to master himself and to endure every crisis the world could throw at him. But it could not give him the power to change the fundamental character of his own son. He had conquered the Parthians, survived the plague, and forgiven a traitor, but he was ultimately defeated by the intractable problem of his own succession. He was trapped, forced to continue fighting for an empire that he knew he would be leaving in the hands of a man utterly unfit to rule it. In the year 178, the aging emperor returned to the Danube frontier one last time. He was nearly 60 years old, a great age for a Roman, and his health was broken by years of hardship and chronic illness. Yet he was determined to see his grand strategic plan through to the end, to secure the new provinces of Marcomannia and Sarmatia and create a lasting peace. For 2 more years, he directed the war from his military camp. But in March of the year 180, while at his headquarters in the city of Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, he fell gravely ill. The cause of his death was most likely the plague, which still lingered in the army camps. As he lay dying, he faced his own end with the same stoic calm he had cultivated his entire life. He gathered his friends and, instead of dwelling on his own fate, he urged them to think of the welfare of the state and the challenges that his young son would now face alone. After 7 days of illness, refusing food and water in his final hours, Marcus Aurelius died. His son Commodus was now the sole master of the Roman world. His first act as emperor was to completely undo his father's life's work. He had no interest in the grim, difficult task of securing new provinces. He wanted the glory, the pleasure, and the adulation that awaited him in Rome. He quickly concluded a peace treaty with the defeated Germanic tribes, abandoning the vast territories that his father had spent a decade and countless lives to conquer. He declared victory and hurried back to the capital to celebrate a triumph he had not earned. The grand strategic plan to secure the northern frontier was abandoned forever. This immediate reversal casts a shadow over Marcus Aurelius's legacy as an emperor. It is a legacy of profound paradox. On one hand, he was a model ruler, hardworking, conscientious, just, and deeply committed to the public good. He successfully guided the Roman state through an almost unprecedented series of crises: a major war on 2 fronts, a catastrophic plague, and an internal rebellion. He held the crumbling world together through sheer force of will and personal integrity. On the other hand, his reign marks the definitive end of the Pax Romana. The crises he weathered left the empire permanently weakened. The plague had shattered its demographics and economy. The constant warfare had drained its treasury and stretched its military to the breaking point. And his single greatest failure, his inability to either reform his son or to disinherit him, proved to be a catastrophic error. The succession of Commodus unleashed an era of tyranny, corruption, and instability that would ultimately lead to a new round of civil wars. Marcus Aurelius is called the last of the 5 good emperors for a reason. After him, the long decline began. But if his political legacy is one of tragic paradox, his philosophical legacy is one of immortal triumph. While his empire is gone, his dynasty forgotten, and his military victories are mere footnotes in history. His book, The Meditations, has endured. It has been read and revered for nearly 2,000 years by an incredible diversity of people. By kings and statesmen, by generals and artists, by theologians and modern psychologists. It has become a timeless manual for leadership, self-discipline, and finding inner peace in a chaotic world. His true empire was not the physical territory he ruled, but the inner citadel he built for himself, whose architecture he recorded in his private journal. Perhaps the most fitting symbol of his strange dual legacy can be found in a bronze statue in the city of Rome. The magnificent equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, showing the bearded emperor on horseback, is the only surviving bronze equestrian statue of a Roman emperor to have survived from antiquity. Throughout the Middle Ages, all the other statues of the pagan emperors were melted down for their valuable metal to make coins, bells, or cannons. The statue of Marcus was spared due to a remarkable historical mistake. For centuries, it was misidentified as a statue of Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor. Believing it to be a monument to this revered Christian figure, the popes and rulers of medieval Rome protected it. It is a beautiful and final irony. The image of the last great pagan Stoic philosopher was saved from destruction by a Christian error. It survived, much like his book, through a fortunate accident of history, a case of mistaken identity. His reign was the end of a golden age, but his thoughts and even his image proved to be timeless. Why do we still listen to this voice, nearly 2,000 years after it was silenced? In an age of technological wonders and scientific progress, why do we still turn to the private diary of a long-dead Roman emperor for guidance? The answer is that the problems Marcus Aurelius faced, the fundamental questions he wrestled with in his tent on the banks of the Danube, are the same problems we face today. His world was one of plague, war, political division, and personal loss. Our world is one of pandemics, global conflicts, social upheaval, and private griefs. The external details have changed, but the internal human challenges remain identical. How do we cope with stress and anxiety? How do we find a sense of purpose when the world seems chaotic and meaningless? How do we deal with difficult people, with injustice, with our own frustrations and failings? How do we face the unavoidable fact of our own mortality? These are not second-century questions. They are human questions. The Meditations endures because it offers no miracles, no mystical revelations, and no easy promises of salvation. Its power is in its profound practicality. It is an owner's manual for the human mind. The techniques Marcus practiced, separating judgment from external events, rehearsing for future challenges, taking a cosmic view of one's problems, are the ancient precursors to modern psychological practices like cognitive behavioral therapy. He understood, nearly 2 millennia ago, the fundamental principle that our inner world is not shaped by events, but by our response to them. What makes his voice so compelling is its honesty. He does not present himself as a perfected sage, dispensing wisdom from on high. He presents himself as a man in the midst of a struggle. We hear him chiding himself for his own anger, reminding himself to get out of bed in the morning to do his duty, and constantly working to be a better, more patient, and more just person. This vulnerability is what makes him so relatable. He is not a distant marble statue. He is a fellow traveler, wrestling with the same demons we do. And the power of his words is magnified 1,000 times by who he was and the circumstances under which he wrote. When Marcus writes about maintaining calm in the face of chaos, we know he is writing from a war zone. When he writes about forgiving those who have wronged him, we know he is writing as a man who was betrayed by his most trusted general. When he writes about enduring grief, we know he is a father who buried many of his own children. His life is the ultimate proof of concept for his philosophy. He did not just preach these ideas. He lived them under the most extreme pressure imaginable. His words have authority not because he was an emperor, but because they were tested in the crucible of his life. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, failed in his ultimate political goal. He could not preserve the golden age or secure a worthy successor. His reign was a noble struggle, but it was the beginning of the end for the Pax Romana. But Marcus Aurelius, the man, achieved something far more lasting. In his private struggle to save his own soul from the corrupting influence of power and despair, he created an immortal guide to the art of living. He left behind a voice that continues to teach us that while we may be powerless over the grand sweep of history, we have absolute power over our own inner world. He was the master of the globe who reminded us that the only kingdom truly worth ruling is the one within.